A few weeks ago, our team received a story that left us completely speechless. It came from a woman named Nicole, a 40-year-old, who had spent her entire adult life being dismissed, mocked, and quietly erased by her own family. For decades, her mother introduced her to relatives the same way. "Oh, Nicole, she does some boring government paperwork, nothing special." At her younger sister's wedding, that humiliation reached its peak. In front of 200 guests, Nicole's mother grabbed the spotlight and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that her eldest daughter was just a low-level clerk with no ambition. The whole room laughed. Nicole sat there silent, while her own family treated her like a punchline. But here's what nobody in that room knew. Not the guests, not the bride, not even Nicole's own mother. There was a reason Nicole never talked about her career. A reason her name didn't appear in any public records. A reason she had disappeared for 18 months without explanation. And when the groom suddenly stood up, took the microphone and turned toward Nicole, with a look no one expected, everything satisfying that Nicole had waited 40 years for was about to unfold in front of the very people who had spent a lifetime looking down on her. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It completely destroyed the lie Nicole's mother had been telling for over a decade. "My name is Nicole Ward. I'm 40 years old, and I've spent the last 2 decades serving my country in ways I'm not allowed to talk about. If you looked me up online, you'd find almost nothing. No LinkedIn profile, no Instagram, no public record of the work that has defined my entire adult life. That's not an accident. That's the job. I want to tell you something that took me a long time to understand. When you grow up being underestimated, you start to believe that invisibility is the same as safety. You learn to stay quiet to let other people fill in the blanks about who you are. And for most of my career, that worked just fine. The nature of military intelligence requires discretion. I got used to answering questions about my work with vague phrases like government consulting or federal administration. I never minded the anonymity. What I never made peace with, was watching my own mother use that silence as a weapon against me. My mother's name is Linda. She's 65 years old, and she has spent most of her life curating the family image like it was a museum exhibit. Every holiday card, every Facebook post, every conversation at church or the grocery store, all of it was designed to present the Ward family as successful, put together, and admirable. My younger sister, Megan, fit perfectly into that vision. She's 32, works in marketing, got engaged to a wonderful man named Daniel, and has the kind of life that photographs well. When my mother introduces Megan to people, her voice lifts with pride. She talks about Megan's promotions, her beautiful apartment, her upcoming wedding. She shows pictures on her phone. She beams. When my mother introduces me, the energy shifts. Her voice drops half an octave. She waves her hand dismissively and says something like, "Oh, Nicole does some government paperwork. Nothing exciting. Not everyone can be a go-getter like Megan." Then she changes the subject. I've heard variations of this script for over 15 years. At first I thought she was just being careless. Then I realized she was being carefully, constructing a version of me that made her feel better about the daughter she couldn't show off. I wasn't absent from her story. I was edited, reduced, rewritten into someone mediocre enough to make Megan's shine look even brighter. I never corrected her. Partly because my work genuinely required discretion, and I couldn't explain what I actually did. But partly because I learnt something painful a long time ago. Some people don't want to know the truth about you. They want to keep believing the story they've already written. And my mother had written hers. In her version, I was the quiet, unremarkable daughter who never quite figured out her life. In her version, I had quit my job due to stress during an 18-month period when I actually disappeared on a classified deployment overseas. In her version, I was someone to be pitied, tolerated, or politely ignored. So when I received the invitation to Megan's wedding, I knew exactly what to expect. I would be seated far from the family table. My name would be absent from the program. I would smile, stay quiet, and leave early without making a scene. That was the role I had been assigned, and I had learned to play it without complaint. What I didn't expect was the photograph. When I walked into the reception venue, I saw it immediately, a large family portrait displayed on an easel near the entrance. It was from 5 years ago, taken at my parents' anniversary party. I remembered that day clearly because I'd flown in from overseas, specifically to attend. I remembered standing on the left side of the frame, next to my father wearing the navy dress I always wore to family events. But in this version of the photograph, the left side had been cropped. I was gone. Cut out of my own family portrait, like I had never existed at all. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where I should have been, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. It wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. My mother hadn't just been dismissing me all these years. She had been erasing me. I found my seat table 14, near the back, surrounded by distant relatives I barely recognized, and I tried to focus on the flowers, the music, anything other than the tight knot forming in my stomach. That's when I noticed my right hand resting on the tablecloth and the ring I always wore there. It was a simple silver band, old-fashioned, and clearly not expensive. If anyone ever asked about it, I would say it was a gift from someone who believed in me. I never said who. The truth was that it came from my grandmother Eleanor, who gave it to me the day I received my commission. She was the only person in my family who knew what I really did. And she was the only person in my family who had never once made me feel like I needed to be someone else. I looked across the room and saw her, an elderly woman in her early 80s, sitting alone at a corner table. She wasn't on the official guest list. I had told her about the wedding, quietly, even though I asked her not to come. I didn't want to cause problems. But there she was, watching me from across the room, with that familiar, steady gaze. She gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Neither of us moved toward the other. We both understood that this was not the time. Not yet. No one else in that room noticed the exchange. No one else knew that my grandmother had been cut off from the family for 10 years. No one else knew the real reason my mother had told everyone she was getting confused and needed to be protected from stress. The truth was simpler and uglier than that. My grandmother knew things about me that my mother couldn't control. And in my mother's world, anyone who threatened the narrative had to be silenced. I wasn't just overlooked at that wedding. I was standing inside a story that had been carefully rewritten, and the author was sitting at the head table smiling for photographs. The reception dinner began about an hour after the ceremony, and for a little while, I allowed myself to believe the worst was over. I had survived seeing my face cropped out of the family portrait. I had found my seat at the forgotten table, without complaint. I had watched my mother pose for photographs with Megan and Daniel, beaming like the proudest woman in the world without letting the ache in my chest show on my face. I thought maybe I could make it through the rest of the evening, quietly, invisibly, the way I had learned to exist in this family for so many years. I was wrong. The trouble started when conversation at the nearby tables turned to careers. It was the kind of small talk that happens at every wedding, people asking polite questions about jobs, promotions, retirement plans. I was listening to a cousin describe her new position at an accounting firm when I heard a voice from 2 tables over. My Uncle Roger, a man I hadn't seen in perhaps 5 years, was looking directly at me with friendly curiosity. "Nicole?" he called out loud enough for several tables to hear. "I don't think I've ever really known what you do. What exactly is your job these days?" I opened my mouth to answer. I had my usual vague response ready, something about federal administration, nothing too specific, nothing that would invite follow-up questions. But before I could get a single word out, my mother's voice cut across the room like a blade. "Oh, Nicole." Linda laughed, and it was the kind of laugh designed to carry. "She's just some low-level government clerk. Pushes papers around a desk somewhere. Nothing special, really." She paused for effect, glancing around to make sure she had everyone's attention. "Not everyone can have Megan's ambition, you know. Some people are just content with less." The room chuckled. "Not everyone." Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances that suggested they recognized cruelty when they heard it. but enough people laughed that the sound filled the space around me. I watched my mother smile at her own joke, watched her lift her wine glass in a small, self-congratulatory gesture, watched her bask in the attention she had just commanded at my expense. This was not an accident. This was not a careless comment from a mother who simply didn't understand her daughter's work. This was a performance she had been perfecting for years delivered, with the practiced ease of someone who had told this exact joke at dozens of family gatherings, holiday dinners, and casual conversations. She knew precisely what she was doing. She always had. I didn't leave. I didn't argue. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me react. Instead, I lifted my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down on the tablecloth without a word. To anyone watching, I probably looked defeated. Just another quiet, unremarkable woman, accepting her mother's assessment without protest. But inside, something very different was happening. I have spent 20 years working in environments where emotional control is not optional. It is survival. I have sat across from foreign intelligence officers and kept my expression neutral while they tested me for weaknesses. I have delivered briefings to generals while tracking live missile movements on screens behind me, my voice steady, even when the stakes were measured in human lives. A room full of wedding guests laughing at my mother's cruel jokes was uncomfortable, yes, but it was not something that could break me. What I felt in that moment was not humiliation, it was recognition. I had seen this performance before so many times that I knew every beat by heart. And I knew something my mother had never bothered to learn: performances end. They always do. That was when I saw my grandmother stand up. Eleanor rose from her corner table slowly, with the careful dignity of a woman who had lived 82 years and refused to waste any of them on other people's foolishness. She didn't make a scene. She didn't say a word. She simply picked up her purse, pushed her chair in quietly, and began walking toward the door. My mother saw her. I watched Linda's face as she tracked my grandmother's movement across the room, and for exactly 2 seconds, her smile disappeared. Her skin went pale. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. Then just as quickly, the mask slid back into place. She laughed at something another guest said and continued as if nothing had happened. But I had seen it. That flicker of fear. That momentary loss of control. My mother had spent 10 years telling everyone that Eleanor was confused, unstable, too mentally fragile to be trusted. She had cut off all contact between my grandmother and the rest of the family, claiming it was for Eleanor's own protection. And now the woman she had worked so hard to erase had just appeared at her younger daughter's wedding and witnessed her cruelty firsthand. My mother didn't know that I had been visiting Eleanor every month for a decade. She didn't know that Eleanor was sharper than anyone in this room. She didn't know that the woman walking out that door was not leaving in defeat. She was leaving in patience. There was one other person in that room who didn't laugh at my mother's joke. I noticed him because his stillness was so different from everyone else's reaction. He was a man in his early 40s, sitting at a table near the front with some of Daniel's college friends. While the rest of the room chuckled politely, his eyes were fixed on me with an expression I recognized immediately, something between surprise and respect. He studied my posture, my silence, the way I held myself even under public ridicule. Then, without a word, he excused himself from his table and stepped outside. I saw him pull out his phone as he walked through the door. I didn't know his name. I didn't know how he knew Daniel. But I recognized the look in his eyes. It was the look of someone who knew something the rest of the room didn't. They thought this moment belonged to them. They had no idea that outside a phone call was being made and inside a woman who knew my real story had just walked away, waiting for the right moment to return. I learned what happened next from Daniel himself, months after the wedding was over. He told me everything: how he found out what Marcus said to him and why he made the choice he made that evening. At the time, sitting at my forgotten table, While my mother's laughter still echoed in my ears, I had no idea that 3 hours before the ceremony had even begun, the truth about my life had already started to surface in a conversation I was never meant to hear. Daniel was in the groom's suite that afternoon, adjusting his tie in front of a mirror and trying to calm his nerves when his old college friend Marcus arrived early. They hadn't seen each other in nearly a year, so they spent a few minutes catching up, talking about work, about mutual friends, about how strange it felt for Daniel to be getting married. The conversation was light, casual, the kind of easy banter that old friends fall into without effort. Then Marcus glanced out the window and saw me crossing the venue courtyard below, helping arrange some chairs that had been knocked over by the wind. No one had asked me to do it. I just saw something that needed fixing and fixed it. That's who I am. Marcus went completely still. Daniel told me later that it was like watching someone snap to attention. His posture straightened, his expression shifted, and something in his eyes changed from relaxed to razor sharp. He turned to Daniel and asked carefully, "That woman down there, the one in the navy dress, who is she?" Daniel barely looked up from his tie. "Oh, that's Nicole, Megan's older sister. Pretty quiet. I think she works some government desk job or something. Linda doesn't really talk about her much." Marcus stared at Daniel for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and serious. "Daniel, that's not a desk job. That woman is Colonel Nicole Ward. I served under her command in 2019. She ran operations I still can't talk about." Daniel didn't believe him at first. He told me he actually laughed, thinking Marcus was joking. But Marcus wasn't laughing. He explained what he knew. I had joined military intelligence straight out of college and risen through the ranks faster than almost anyone in my cohort. I had commanded classified operations across 3 continents. My name didn't appear in public records because my work required complete anonymity, not as a cover story, but as a matter of national security. The 18 months I had disappeared, the period my mother told everyone I had quit my job due to stress, was actually a deployment so sensitive that even my unit designation remained classified. I wasn't hiding from failure. I was protecting my country by staying invisible. Daniel stood there, in his wedding suit, trying to process the fact that his quiet, overlooked future sister-in-law was one of the highest-ranking intelligence officers Marcus had ever served under. "But her mother says she's just a clerk," Daniel said. "Megan's never mentioned any of this." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Because they don't know. Or they chose not to know. Either way, that's not my story to tell." But there was more, and what Marcus said next hit Daniel harder than the revelation about my rank. 3 years earlier, I'd been promoted to colonel. It was a classified ceremony, but immediate family members were permitted to attend. I had called my mother personally to invite her. I told her it was important to me, that I wanted her to be there, that it would mean everything if she could come. Her response was brief and dismissive. She said she had a charity luncheon that weekend and couldn't rearrange her schedule. "Maybe next time," she said. There was no next time. The only person who showed up to watch me receive my eagle insignia was an elderly woman who introduced herself to Marcus as my grandmother, Eleanor. The same woman Daniel had noticed, sitting alone at a corner table earlier that day, the one no one seemed to recognize or acknowledge. Marcus told Daniel that Eleanor had been sharp, articulate, and composed throughout the entire ceremony. She cried when they pinned the eagle on my shoulder. She told Marcus that she had always known I was destined for something extraordinary, even when no one else in the family believed it. "That woman has dementia," Marcus said to Daniel. Linda told everyone she wasn't mentally stable, that the family had to cut contact for her own protection. But I met her, Daniel. She was sharper than half the officers in that room. Daniel pressed for more, and Marcus told him the rest. 10 years ago, when I was promoted to major, Eleanor had been so proud that she called my mother to share the news. It was the first Linda had heard of my promotion, because she had never bothered to ask real questions about my life. She had never wanted to know. But hearing that her own mother knew something about her daughter, before she did, triggered something in Linda. Within months, she began telling the extended family that Eleanor was getting confused and saying strange things. She claimed Eleanor needed to be isolated from family stress for her own well-being. She cut off all contact and made sure everyone else did the same. She rewrote the story to cast herself as a concerned, protective daughter, caring for a senile mother, when the truth was that she was silencing the only person who knew what I had actually become. Eleanor wasn't confused. She was inconvenient. And my mother had spent a decade making sure no one would ever believe a word she said. Daniel stood in that groom's suite for a long time after Marcus finished talking. He told me later that he felt sick, not because he was nervous about the wedding, but because he was about to marry into a family built on lies. His future mother-in-law wasn't just dismissive or thoughtless. She had been running a calculated campaign for 10 years to erase two women from her own family, her mother and her eldest daughter, and she had done it with a smile, a wave of her hand, and a carefully constructed story that everyone believed. Daniel looked at me differently after that. I didn't know why not yet, but in 3 hours he would stand in front of 200 people and make a choice that would undo 10 years of my mother's carefully constructed lies. The reception speeches began shortly after dinner, and I settled into my chair expecting nothing more than the usual parade of toasts and tearful memories. The father of the bride spoke first. My father, a quiet man who had always loved me but never knew how to stand up to my mother. He talked about Megan's childhood, her determination, her beautiful smile. He didn't mention me once. Then came the maid of honor, one of Megan's college friends, who told a funny story about a road trip they had taken together. Then the best man who made everyone laugh with jokes about Daniel's college days. Light applause, clinking glasses, the comfortable rhythm of a wedding reception, following its familiar script. I had resigned myself to being invisible for the rest of the evening. I had no idea the script was about to be torn apart. Daniel took the microphone one final time after the best man finished. Everyone assumed he was going to offer a last thank you, perhaps a toast to his new in-laws or a sentimental word about the future. I watched him scan the room the way I had seen countless officers scan a briefing room, before delivering unexpected news, deliberate, focused searching for something specific. His eyes found me at my distant table, and for a moment he held my gaze with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he handed his champagne glass to Megan, who looked up at him with confusion. He didn't explain. He simply stepped away from the head table, straightened his posture in a way that made my breath catch in my throat, and turned to face me directly. I knew what was coming half a second before it happened, but knowing didn't prepare me for the impact. Daniel brought his feet together, squared his shoulders, and executed a crisp textbook military salute, the kind of salute that takes years of training to perform correctly, the kind that carries weight and meaning far beyond a simple gesture. The room went silent. 200 guests froze mid-sip, mid-conversation, mid-breath. Forks stopped moving. Whispers died. Every pair of eyes in that reception hall turned to follow Daniel's gaze, trying to understand what they were witnessing. This was not part of the program. Daniel held the salute for 3 full seconds. When he spoke, his voice was clear, steady, and loud enough to reach every corner of the room. To Colonel Nicole Ward, thank you for your service, ma'am. He dropped the salute. For a moment, nothing moved. The silence was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling above us. Then slowly and deliberately, Marcus rose from his seat. He didn't say a word. He simply stood at attention and rendered his own salute, holding it, until Daniel gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. 2 military salutes, in a room full of civilians, carry a weight that words cannot capture. They speak of sacrifice, of duty, of a respect that must be earned through years of service and leadership. And they had just been directed at me, the woman my mother had spent the last 20 years describing as a low-level paper pusher, with no ambition, and nothing worth mentioning. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, like wind moving through tall grass. I heard fragments of confused conversation from every direction. Colonel. Wait, Nicole. Her mother said she was just a clerk. That can't be right. I didn't stand. I didn't salute back. That's not how it works when you're the one being honored. Instead, I simply inclined my head in acknowledgement, the same small gesture I had made 1,000 times before. When receiving respect, I never asked for but always earned. My hands were steady, my expression was calm, but inside something I had kept locked away for 20 years was finally breaking free. Then the doors at the back of the reception hall opened. Eleanor stepped inside, moving slowly, but with the unmistakable dignity of a woman who had spent 82 years refusing to be diminished by anyone. She didn't look at my mother, she didn't acknowledge the stares or the whispers. She walked directly to my table, her eyes fixed on mine, and when she reached me, she cupped my face in both of her weathered hands, the way she used to do when I was a child. Her voice was steady and clear, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear every word. 30 years ago, I told your mother you were born to lead. She spent her whole life trying to make everyone forget that. Then she straightened, turned around, and for the first time looked directly at my mother. Every guest in the room followed her gaze. Linda sat frozen at the head table, her face drained of color, her carefully constructed smile completely gone. She wasn't just exposed for lying about me. She was exposed for lying about her own mother, the woman she had told everyone was confused and mentally unstable. The woman she had cut off from the entire family for a decade was standing in the middle of this reception hall, looking sharper and more coherent than anyone in the room. Eleanor didn't accuse her of anything. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was the accusation. My mother didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't try to defend herself or explain away what was happening. She simply stopped. I watched her smile fade, like a mask being removed. I watched her hands grip the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. I watched her eyes move around the room, seeing for the first time what everyone else was now seeing, the crumbling of a story she had spent 2 decades constructing. Her friends were reconsidering every conversation they had ever had with her. Distant relatives were whispering, connecting dots they had never thought to connect before. No one pointed a finger. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. The salute, the title, my grandmother's words together, they had assembled a truth that required no explanation and allowed no denial. For the first time in my memory, the room wasn't judging me. It was judging her, and my mother knew it. I watched her realize something she had never once considered, that the story she had been telling wasn't the only one in the room anymore, and now everyone could see which one was true. The reception continued after that, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations were quieter, glances were longer, and my mother remained seated at the head table without speaking to anyone for the rest of the evening. I stayed in my chair, accepting the occasional nod or awkward smile from guests who didn't quite know what to say to me now. I didn't need their words. I didn't need their apologies. What I needed was something I hadn't allowed myself to want. In 20 years, the freedom to simply exist without pretending to be less than I was. When the reception finally wound down and guests began drifting toward the parking lot, I stepped outside to get some air. The evening had grown cool, and the stars were bright above the venue, in a way you rarely see in the city. I stood there alone, letting the quiet settle around me when I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I turned, expecting to see my grandmother, but it was Megan. My sister stood a few feet away, her wedding dress slightly wrinkled from hours of dancing and photographs, her makeup smudged from what looked like recent tears. She didn't seem angry. She seemed lost. "Did you know?" Her voice was small, almost childlike. "About Grandma, that she wasn't sick." I looked at my sister, the golden child, the favored daughter, the one who had always received the spotlight. I was denied, and I saw something I hadn't expected. I saw a woman who had been living inside the same lie as everyone else. She wasn't my enemy. She never had been. She was just another person my mother had manipulated, another character in a story written to serve Linda's needs. "I've been visiting her every month for 10 years, I said quietly. Megan's face crumpled. She started to cry, not the polished tears of a bride upset about her special day being overshadowed, but the raw, confused tears of someone realizing that everything she thought she knew about her family was wrong. She had believed our grandmother was mentally unstable. She had believed I was a failure. She had believed our mother was protecting everyone from difficult truths. None of it was real. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." I stepped forward and put my arms around her. For the first time in decades, we stood together, not as competitors in our mother's ranking system, but as two women finally seeing the same truth. Megan wasn't a villain. She was a victim, just like me, just like Eleanor. The only difference was that she was learning it tonight, while I had known for years. Later, as I was walking to my car, my mother appeared in the parking lot. She approached me with her arms crossed, her face tight, with barely controlled emotion. I could see her rehearsing words in her head, trying to find the right angle to make this my fault somehow. "I was protecting this family's image," she said, her voice strained. "You have to understand, everything I did was to keep things stable, to keep people from asking questions I couldn't answer." I let her finish. Then I spoke calmly, without raising my voice. "You weren't protecting the family. You were protecting yourself. From being compared to your daughter. From having anyone see that I succeeded in ways you couldn't control or take credit for. You weren't ashamed of my failure, Mother. You were threatened by my success." She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. We both knew I was right. We had always both known, even if neither of us had ever said it out loud. "I'm not cutting you off," I continued. "I'm not asking for an apology you don't mean. But I will not be erased anymore. If you can't tell the truth about who I am, then don't mention me at all." That's not a request, that's a boundary. I didn't wait for her response. I simply walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dark parking lot with nothing but the consequences of her own choices for company. Eleanor was waiting by my car. I helped her into the passenger seat, and we drove in comfortable silence for most of the journey to her apartment. The road stretched out ahead of us, lit by street lamps and the occasional passing headlight, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the peace of resolution or forgiveness, but the peace of finally being seen for who I actually was. "You didn't need that salute to be who you are," Eleanor said, finally, her voice soft in the darkness of the car. I smiled. "No, but it felt good to stop hiding." She reached over and patted my hand, the way she used to do when I was young, when she would tell me I was destined for great things, even as my mother rolled her eyes in the background. "Your mother will never understand what she lost. But that's not your burden to carry." I realized then that Eleanor had always understood something my mother never could, that strength doesn't come from being celebrated by others. It comes from knowing your own worth, even when no one else sees it. The woman my mother had dismissed as confused and unstable had been the clearest thinker in our family all along. I want to say something to any woman who has lived the kind of life I've lived. If you've spent years being underestimated, overlooked, or defined by someone else's narrative about who you are, I want you to know this many women aren't defeated by lack of ability. They're defeated because they spent too long letting someone else tell their story. I'm not telling you to cut off your family or demand public recognition for everything you've accomplished. I'm saying something simpler than that. Freedom begins when you stop asking permission to be yourself. The salute didn't give me my rank. The truth didn't give me my worth. But for the first time in 40 years, I didn't have to make myself smaller just to make my mother feel bigger. And that, more than any medal or title, was the promotion I'd been waiting for. Fan Keta. And that is where Nicole's story ends. Not with a dramatic confrontation or a severed family, but with something far more powerful. A woman who finally stopped shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's version of her life. When Nicole first sent us this story, she included a note that stayed with me long after I finished reading. She wrote, "I'm not sharing this because I want people to feel sorry for me. I'm sharing it because I spent 40 years believing that keeping the peace meant keeping quiet, and I want other women to know they don't have to make that same mistake. There's a lesson in Nicole's journey that goes beyond revenge or family drama. It's about something we don't talk about enough, the silent cost of letting someone else control your story. Nicole wasn't weak. She wasn't a failure. She was a decorated military officer who had dedicated her life to serving her country. But none of that mattered inside her own family, because her mother had decided years ago that Nicole's success was a threat rather than a blessing. And for a long time, Nicole accepted that role. She stayed quiet. She didn't correct the lies. She made herself smaller, so her mother could feel bigger. How many of us have done the same thing? How many women have dimmed their own light because someone in their life couldn't handle the brightness? How many daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers have swallowed their achievements, hidden their pride, and accepted someone else's diminished version of who they are, just to keep the peace? Nicole's story reminds us that peace built on lies isn't really peace at all. It's just silence. And silence over time becomes its own kind of prison. The real victory in this story isn't the salute. It isn't the public exposure of Linda's lies. It's the moment Nicole decided she would no longer participate in her own erasure. She didn't destroy her family. She didn't demand revenge. She simply drew a line and said, "You can no longer define me. That job belongs to me now." That's a choice any of us can make at any age, in any situation. It's never too late to reclaim your own narrative. If Nicole's story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to diminish your worth or rewrite your story? How did you handle it? Drop your experiences in the comments below your story. Might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this is your first time watching our channel, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss stories like this one. We share real stories from real people. Every week, stories about resilience, redemption, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up for yourself when no one else will. Thank you for watching until the very end. Your time means everything to us. And remember, you are not the story someone else tells about you. You are the story you choose to live. We'll see you in the next one.